So the government is hopeless, obviously. But is it obvious? I think the question becomes an important one when we analyze the reasoning behind the inefficiencies of government, of the bureaucracy, and start to understand what it is exactly about this institution across the West that is starting to fail us so badly, even though it is supposed to be the cornerstone of our liberal democracies, basically. In this analysis, I'll walk you through some of the more interesting data, but then also a little bit of Max Weber and his opinions on civil servants and bureaucrats in general, because I believe the intertwining of these two elements, so the structure on one hand and call it the human resources on the other, has accelerated the downfall of our institutions in a way that has unforeseen repercussions. Now, I like to play the blame game on this channel, obviously, because I feel it's very useful to designate culpability where it's warranted. And I think that it's very clear that there are elements in society that are worse for the prospering of general society, and that if a very astute, perspicacious politician were to remove these elements, then society is materially better off. And then you can go back to quibbling about ideologies and about small, inconsequential nothings and pettifogging. But I think at the moment we very much understand there's a existential crisis here in the West on many certain deleterious elements in our societies. And it's represented by the non-Faustian, the non-Gothic. It's a very easy way to summarize why that is the case. But there's been a transgression against the state from before even the immigration issue, whereby we have allotted to the idea of the state a certain attribute, a certain characteristic that we now associate with it, and that thus when we think of careers and vocations as young men, we also attribute the feelings of that to it. And that may sound slightly confusing, but I'll explain a little bit further as the thesis here about the downfall of Western institutions, government especially, is that young, vital young men, violence-filled, don't consider the government a worthwhile job or career space because of many reasons. The first of which is basically that it's really poorly paid. And in a capitalist society, you're encouraging young men in particular who have very low status because there's just a lot of them. And when you start, usually in a middle class or lower household, you don't have much resources of your own. And the competition is quite fierce for young men in that regard. It's a little bit easier for women, and the choice has been made that women would support themselves. So they've started to encroach on that, say, resource capturing part of the social pie, which is fine. But what it does do is, once again, constrict the amount of resource positions that young men are vying for. So this is why there's a potential downfall that is very glacial in its movement, but clear in its impact. So the year-on-year changes in statistical, you could say, digression around men in the workplace doing certain things is always trending one way. Fewer men are going to universities and colleges, fewer men are participating in the labor force as a percentage, and there is a lot of disregard for the armed services. For instance, most armed services in the West are now populated by men with very little in the way of potential opportunities, but then also foreigners. And so when you start to introduce foreigners into your armed services, you have a dilution of the ethos of the service. So why it stands for what it does and what it's supposed to be doing starts to lose its tactile and very tribalistic nature. War and warriors, but then armies, have always been formed along tribal lines for very obvious reasons, that there is supposed to be a concerted affair towards protecting our realm and punishing our enemies in a combined arms fashion. And so that was usually why the more ethnically aligned your armed forces are, the better served they were. There's been a few instances where this has been not the case. So the condottieri and things, and mercenary armies, particularly used by Prussia and things like this, but they were not as effective, and there's a lot of reasoning around why you don't want to let loose a bunch of foreign men into a neighbor's territory, or even into your own territory for that matter. And so what we can call then this instance is the degradation of the valor of the institutional regard that we have for the West. Now, Max Weber, who was a sociologist in Germany, has a very, very long treatise on this thing called Economy and Society, and I'll just read you a very small excerpt here around how he starts to describe bureaucracy, at least, and from a vocational perspective, hopefully give you some context. That the office is a vocation, Beruf, finds expression first in the requirement of a prescribed course of training, which demands the entire working capacity for a long period of time, and in generally prescribed special examinations as prerequisites of employment. Furthermore, it finds expression in that the position of the official is in the nature of a duty, Pflicht. This determines the character of his relations in the following manner. Legally and actually, office holding is not considered ownership of a source of income to be exploited for rents or emoluments in exchange for the rendering of certain services, as was normally the case during the Middle Ages and frequently up to the threshold of recent times. Nor is office holding considered a common exchange of services, as in the case of free employment contracts. Rather, entrance into an office, including one in the private economy, is considered an acceptance of a specific duty of fealty to the purpose of the office, Amtstrue, in return for the grant of a secure existence. It is decisive for the modern loyalty to an office that, in the pure type, it does not establish a relationship to a person, like the vassal's or disciple's faith under the feudal or patrimonial authority, but rather is devoted to impersonal and functional purposes. These purposes, of course, frequently gain an ideological halo from cultural values, such as state, church, community, party, or enterprise, which appears as surrogates for this worldly or otherworldly personal master, and which are embodied by a given group. He then goes on further down to say, usually the social esteem of the officials is especially low where the demand for expert administration and the hold of status conventions are weak. This is often the case in new settlements by virtue of great economic opportunities and the great instability of their social stratification. Witness the United States. Now, I think this, firstly, comes from his parallax of being in the German Empire at the time, and that there is an understanding of notional or national duty that the German had that was superior to the Anglo-American or the Anglo-West, because the German held sacred some level, I think, of, well, at least admiration of the fatherland, and that contributing to it was held in some esteem. It was something that was to be lauded and potentially worked toward, as in when you graduated high school, gymnasium, you would go then towards working in the civil service as your vocation because it was a higher calling. There was something to it that gave you status, that gave you the feeling of power, of belonging, of making a difference, we'll say. This obviously evaporated at the end of World War II, so the German cannot no longer hold a sense of duty to the fatherland because the fatherland no longer exists. It's a quasi-state reinforced by American-backed bases, or at that time also Soviet-backed bases, where they've partitioned what was the fatherland into a regional parochial territory, and now it's obviously lost that spirit that it had. So you remove the strain of thought, the undercurrent of young men going into civil service for a specific reason is lost. It's diluted out. Now, the you could say repercussion from that is in the West we have one, and so we gung-ho capitalists went full throttle, pedals to the metal in terms of making sure that we tried to earn as much money. We've always done this in the Anglo-West, where booty and loot and pecuniary rewards were held in the highest esteem, and that there's a whole section in Spengler's works and where he goes on to wax lyrical on this, because it's seen in the England first, and then obviously in the rest of the Anglo-West, the primacy of your life was to work hard and of your spoils, thereby maintain a certain position in society. If you're a gentleman or you're a club member or you're a dignitary or whatever it was that you were allowed to purchase through being moneyed. That was the idea. And you can see this in a lot of cases with Americans, particularly socialites and heiresses marrying into royal British families, because there was an understanding here that money was actually very important, even though there was a superficial veneer of status of position. It was much more around how much money do you have, because if you have more money than someone else, then your status is higher. There's very few exceptions to this in England and in the American West. But for us, the notion that you would go into government as a young man full of vital spirit and vigor and vim is nonsensical. It's just silliness. It's like, why would I want to go and work for a bunch of old hags and grumpy old fat men? I wouldn't want to do this. Nothing about this screams power. It doesn't scream life-fulfilling duty. It just screams boring, banal nothingness, where I waste my days away on my phone at my desk pretending to work, because I know that the old 55-year-old next to me is also pretending to work, and his boss or her boss is doing the same thing, all and about, doing less than probably 7 hours a week, captured by the entire department that we're paying not insignificant sums to at not insignificant numbers of employed people. So this is that idea that young men will cease to want to go into the civil service bureaucracies in large swathes, because it's a very unsatisfying, unfulfilling idea, and that being a civil servant for 40 years to get a pension, I'd rather get shot in the face in a battlefield somewhere, because the idea that this is a fulfilling life that is satisfying to you is always going to filter out the good from the bad anyway. So you're left with the bad, the weak, the callow, the very unadmirable individuals who are going into plod along in their tawdry and doldrum lives with nothing in terms of excitement, in terms of power, in terms of expressiveness, in terms of creativity, in terms of anything of value that we would consider from the human experience. No, I'm going to clock in and clock out my 35 hours a week, whatever it is, in the civil service for 40 years until I get a pension. I can retire in Spain for 7 years and then die of geriatric disease of some sort, probably a heart or a lung disease. So this is the idea that the civil service has lost its luster, because it has, and that's because young men want to do young men things in a capitalist society, which is, surprise, surprise, earn money. Now, the manifold repercussions or the manifold consequences to this start to rear their heads in many multifarious ways, really. And so just looking at some statistics here to give you an idea of why my hypothesis here on this is obviously correct, and the situation is quite dire as well. So if we take a look at some of these statistics from the UK, for instance, let me just make my face bigger actually, make you suffer the handsomeness. The key statistics here from the civil service in 2025, so this is the British civil service, show a lot of enlightening findings. Now, we can see here that the majority of staff in the civil service are women, so it's 54.6%, which is an increase from the year. So there's more women basically, both in a majority sense and in an increasing sense, so proportionate to men. There's a overrepresentation of ethnic minorities, 18% versus 16.6%, so that's a large increase of ethnic minorities. So you're starting to paint a picture of what the typical civil servants, if I take 100 civil servants, 55 almost are women, and 18 of them are brown. Then you can say that 18% have a disability. You're starting to obviously have some overlap here in terms of statistical probabilities of being a female brown disabled person. But in general, we can just start to highlight the valence of all of these Venn diagram circles. 7.2% identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or recorded their sexual orientation as other. LGBO, the BO being very important there, I assume. Off-putting BO, would you not say? The up from 6.9%, so it's getting more homosexual or queer, maybe we should say. And 75% are working at executive officer grade and above, which is higher than previously. I'm presuming that that means they're paid more. The median age is 44, so very aged. Headcount increased across all regions. So there's, I think I didn't highlight here, there's a 550,000 civil servants, and that is what you heard. 550,000. There's more civil servants than the country of Iceland. It has people, almost double, well, maybe 1.6 or something. That's how many people are trying to make the UK and Great Britain run effectively from the governmental side. Yeah, we'll let that sit. We'll sit with you for just a moment. The idea then that the average Englishman is going to want to join a bureaucracy that looks like this is already an unhinged delusion. We can see that salary alone is not going to sway these things. So the vacuum left by lack of young men will be filled naturally by first women, but then also different types of young men, particularly foreign young men who want what would be a very cushy job with very little responsibility, no oversight, and almost an impossibility to be made redundant. And there's almost no moratorium on government hiring as well. So you'll have an increase almost year on year, infinitely, basically, until they bankrupt the country, because the government doesn't understand efficiency. It's not supposed to. And this works when there's a certain level of guidance of meritocracy in a government system. And when there's not, then you have bloated largesse. And from that, we can see that there's a stupefaction of a nation led by its civil service. And the English are nothing if not very, very dumb. So that we have here the last interesting statistics, I think, is around median salary as £35,000 per year. The average Englishman in the countryside doesn't earn that much. Average here and median obviously being distinctual factors around this. If you're a median wage earner in, say, London, you're probably on a lot more, £60,000 a year. And if you're an average salary man in the boonies in the moors, then you'll probably be on something like £22,000 or £18,000. There's a distinct difference around averages and medians in the UK. You have a lot of oscillation between areas and types of professions. Statistically, you're unlikely to be paid much if you are a blue-collar worker in the UK. Even as a median or higher earner, you'll never crack £40,000-50,000, but the white collar will have a greater chance of that. So if you're a lawyer or a software engineer or something, then you'll have a higher earning potential. But in general, there's a malaise amongst the English around salaries, and there has been for about 200 years. The Englishman has never been a good or hard worker, which is slightly curious because the Englishman has kind of been rich for a very long time. And they've not understood why they've been rich, the Englishmen. And it's because of their spoliation or despoliation of the world in a good way. You go out as an adventurer, as a booty pirate treasure seeker, and actually plunder and come back with the treasure, and then your X generations of descendants are now secured financially, and then they'll squander obviously a lot away doing other random things like gambling and lascivious activities, lechery. But the idea then that the Englishman is good at something is definitely true. It just happens to be true at something, or good at something that is no longer that necessary, which is, as I said, piratical in nature. And so you're left with the underperformance of a very laggard, lackadaisical populace. Now, there is a graph here actually, and I'll read it to you if you can't see, but the grey line here is disabled people going up to 18%, ethnic minorities up to 18% as well, and the LGBTO up to 7.2%. All higher representations than what you would find normally in society, with maybe the exception of disability because of the large definitional range of what is disabled in the UK nowadays. So you can be disabled with anxiety, I believe, and some other very small, minor mental health issues, which are totally real and not made up at all. And I think it's important to also mention here, particularly on the UK, because it's such a dire, bleak place, is that across, well, I've done this on several videos now, but across almost every metric, the UK is malfunctioning. And this is particularly true for its governmental services, like the armed forces, which is hugely suffering from we call it a muscle drain, maybe brain drain, but the muscle drain where there's just very few good soldiers signing up. The Great British Isles, the UK and Ireland, have always had excellent soldiers and officers, and so you're once again losing the things that made you great because of the lack of appeal, the lack of adulation, the lack of pay, the lack of anything substantial, anything that would lure you into these positions is gone. It's non-existent now, and so the UK is having to suffer through that, which is extremely funny, ironic almost. The last bit here about the UK, and then I'll just transition to America for you Americans, is to look at the median salary of a civil servant, just so you can feel good about yourself. So the idea that you, as a civil servant, can take up a position, and I don't want to call it work, because very few civil servants actually work. And if they're doing work, you can be guaranteed it's busy work, it's nugatory, it's going to be some of the worst tripe you've ever seen published as a deliverable, and in general just ineffectual at garnering outcomes. There's nothing in the civil servant's mind that has an idea of an outcome with a goal substantive to a strategy around how to achieve something. There's a dictate from above, and that can be from a secretary or a politician or some superior, some senior, and there's, well, we need this as the outcome, go, and you'll have a whole bunch of nominally smart people working like headless chickens. And so we pay them much more handsomely than I think is obviously reserved for the type of employment they're contributing to the greater value of Great Britain. But in general, you can see here that almost 3,000 are paid. 3,000 people are paid over 100k, but then substantially more. So here it's about 50,000 earn more than 60 to 100,000 pounds a year. And of this, I think you could probably ascertain that the higher you're paid, the more senior you are, and that's not reflecting at all outcomes, meritocracy, any type of betterment for society in a quantitative sense, and rather probably reflects some credentials that you have, which connections you have, how long and tenured you are. And then in general, if you're underrepresented, they probably would DEI, give you a promotion or something like this. Anyway, that's to make you feel really good about what you're paying for in your tax pence. I'll just read a little bit more here from Max Weber on this, because I think it's very important to understand that bureaucracy structured effectively is necessary. It works, I wouldn't say well. It performs a function that we've designated it to, and in doing so, fulfills something vital for a large society, for a huge collective, cohesive body of people. So say that it's 50 million people. There just needs to be some construct around society's governance. It just is a necessary evil in many senses. You can transition it into a good, into a better functioning machine with certain attributes attached to it. And this goes back to, as I said, the way the German populace thought about duty to the fatherland. Once again, we defeated that in World War II, yeehaw. So now we're stuck with what he defines here, and I'll just walk you through a little bit of that. Max Weber, brain power. Within the bureaucracy, therefore, the measure of independence legally guaranteed in this manner by tenure is not always a source of increased status for the official whose position is thus secured. Indeed, often the reverse holds, especially in communities with an old culture and a high degree of differentiation. For the subordination under the arbitrary rule of the master also guarantees the maintenance of the conventional seigneurial style of living for the official, and it does this the better, the stricter it is. Therefore, the conventional esteem for the official may rise precisely because of the absence of such legal guarantees In the same way as, during the Middle Ages, the esteem of the ministerials rose at the expense of the freeman, and that of the king's judge at the expense of the folk judge. In Germany, the military officer or the administrative official can be removed from office at any time, or at least far more readily than the independent judge, who never pays with the loss of his office for even the grossest offence against the code of honour or against the conventions of the salon. For this very reason, the judge is, if other things are equal, considered less socially acceptable by high society than are officers and administrative officials whose greater dependence on the master is a better guarantee for the conformity of their lifestyle with the status conventions. Of course, the average official strives for a civil service law which, in addition to materially securing his old age, would also provide increased guarantees against his arbitrary removal from office. This striving, however, has its limits. A very strong development of the right to the office naturally makes it more difficult to staff officers with an eye to technical efficiency and decreases the career opportunities of ambitious candidates. Weber here clearly defining what we're experiencing in that way. And I think in the American case, it's actually easy to make the hypothesis, the thesis stick with the null hypothesis that no one would go into public service because public service earns less money, and in America, the capitalistic mecca of the globe, well, at least if it wasn't before, say, Singapore or somewhere, but the idea here is that you would only ever choose to go into the civil service as a young man in America is if it was I would say, regional-based decision. I grew up in X place, thus my very, very limited opportunities do not allow for me to do certain things. It's also very difficult to make this argument sensibly because the freedom to move, both as an American but in a modern age with information prevalence and things like that, it's a very difficult understanding to be had, that you were so landlocked by your circumstances that you couldn't move for any reason. It's not nigh on unbelievable, but it's slightly preposterous. So then we look at why, and particularly where young men go. So why do they go into private sector? Why do they go into the merchant classes? And why do they, and which specific? Now, what was probably historically different industries, so you could think of natural resources and railroads as say early historical capitalist classes and capitalist ventures for Americans into industry, and then throughout industry into, say, financial products, and then from financial products out into we call it tech now, technology, and you can see that reflected here in what is a chart, and this is the gender and diversity of USA employees in top companies, because unlike Britain historically, America actually has had a small proportion of its populace always been foreign. So the Faustian American man never maintained more than, say, 90% of the occupation of the land, and 85% maybe. When you have Amerindians and you have Africans who live alongside you, they occupy certain places in society. When they are second-class citizens, when they're denuded of legal rights and attributes, then it's much easier to understand that they're not going to be staffing your governmental institutions and your bureaucracies. But when they are elevated, emancipated from these shackles, then they're allowed to participate. And when they're allowed to participate, then they will gravitate towards the low-hanging fruit and the easy wins, jobs that aren't particularly lustful for the young aspiring man, which was the entrant into the workforce at that time, and the young aspiring woman later on. But that was coexisting, or the efforts of suffragettes and all this sort of women's movement coincided with much larger rights being acquiesced and given, approbated to the wider populace. So you had this very kaleidoscopic affair of rights for different people being granted along the same time. So in like a 50, 60 year period, you went from having only Gothic white men between ages typically of 18 and, or even say 15 or 14 and 70 participating in labor force, in the civil service, in the bureaucracies, in politics, in all of these institutions. So these are institutions that are set up to be governed and involved with men of this type of character, of this type of upbringing and things like this, to then have it be diversified. And when it gets diversified fast, and it's not equipped to be able to reflect this change in its body, in its composition. So you get a very, very fast dissolution, and you can see that with the American system. But getting back slightly on track here is to reflect to you what I'm talking about here, and that's most men, because in capitalist society, want to and need to earn money for the status effect. To be high status in America, you have to have millions of dollars, and to earn millions of dollars, you go work for these tech companies. And you can see here just a list, hopefully very clear, but anything from Shopify, Cloudera, Intel, Netflix, Apple, Intuit, Airbnb, Meta, Tesla are predominantly male. And so there's maybe one or two companies here which hit a 40 to 50% balance of female employees, so something like Etsy or Natera, but everything else is dominated by men. This makes sense in a capitalist society where men have more need, and this is a existential need for money, than women who are not particularly fussed by money in many ways. Not to say women don't like money, it's just very feminine disposition around money, which is fine. It just is. The masculine definition of money is that I want more of it than my fellow man so that I can distinguish myself against him. And this goes into different areas of the general sociology. But you could say it's a little bit to do with sexual mating patterns as well, that rich men, or more wealthy or more resource gathering, hoarding men tend to do better in that regard. It's not the only reason. There is you say exogenous and endogenous factor to this, but when it comes to, well, we call them intrinsic and extrinsic motivators, we think of it like that. Now, the other cofactor here, confounding factor almost, is that the US population is built up of different races as well, and they participate in different ways. And you can see that here with the this other axis, with this other legend here, which tells you what composition of people are relative to their broader makeup of America, the ratio basically. So this is relative to the broader USA. If you're a woman or a man, we're covered in the employees percentage, and you can see, the representation here in the pink being less female if it goes to the left and more female if it goes to the right, and then with men, vice versa, but then also with the races. So Asian is in here in red, and you can see that Hispanic and Latino is green, the African Americans are purple, and then the whites are the big blue, and then the other ones we don't really care so much about because they are infinitesimal in their representation. But you can see something very interesting, I guess, which is that there are companies which have more whites than the broader populace does, not by a lot, and this is probably because that whites in general are misrepresented statistically in America. We'll put it like that. The way to be calculated as a white is a very confusing mess in America because the idea of certain ethnic backgrounds and races or whatever is a little bit fuzzy, and the data collection doesn't work so well. So Middle Easterners and Turks, and you can go so far, I think, is to say a lot of Eastern Europeans aren't what we would typically find or call as, say, white, as Gothic white, because the nature of a founding society is made up of its ethnicity and the totality and the generality around how we think about the composition. You would say that America was traditionally founded by the English, the French, the Dutch, and some Spanish, plus some second wave, we call them Teutonic peasant farmers. So the idea then that would be what you would call an American, and everyone else is peripheral to that, is ancillary to that. Now, the way that this affects the makeup of businesses is found obviously most funny in the tech businesses, which use the most, say, labor or non-cognitive level class. So, and to make the case here, you can see that Africans, by far the highest preponderance for working at Amazon, whereas they have the least inclusion. And let me try and find here in it looks like software. So you'll find that there's very few, and you could call it an underrepresentation here, but it goes into, we could call maybe more merit-based. We've always understood that the capitalist system has the operational chassis of a free market. You choose who and where you'll go and work for, and the employer's discretion allows for them to be picky, and they can choose along certain guidelines. Now, they're not allowed to discriminate on your identity from that level, but obviously recruiters do that, and you can see it in the reverse way with the H-1B scandal, that Indians will always hire Indians over anyone else, and this has probably been true for every other race other than white people, who are fairly meritocratic. Now, this is once again just to say that white men in particular are always going to perform the baseline level of the society that they've founded. So we consider that the one index, and everything is balanced relative to that. Now, Asians are way outperforming white people here in the tech space, and this has several implications, but it does particularly around the availabilities of opportunities in a society that's supposed to be structured towards the betterment of the people who founded it and their descendants. Now, you're going to make the argument that they're pro-migration if it's educated or if it's skilled migration, benefits the society. Now, the benefit here is always economic. It's always an economist telling you that your society is getting better because you're having people who earn more live alongside of you. That's the definition. So look at all these metrics, look at all these economic variables that have been able to calculate that show your society is now better. Don't you want more of this? Should we not import millions upon millions upon millions more of this type of person who will uplift your society? Now, from the economist perspective, they're absolutely correct. You can make it a mathematical model which shows you improved number goes up. We've seen this. We've also understood that this is just a self-defeating prophecy, basically, around what makes society good is a reflection of its product rather than producing more of something we feel as if is associated to the reason it's good in the first place. We're saying, like, I'm making more money, therefore, if we import people who make us more money, that's better, rather than saying my society is really, really good and it happens to make a lot of money because the people who are part of, who make up the society, just happen to make money. And this goes into Max Weber's Protestant work ethic. There is an idea here around the pride of just working hard and accomplishing things and producing products and making and completing tasks. This has a correspondence to money, to productive capabilities from that lens. And you can say, look, I can always lend a quantitative prism to any venture and say, look, how much money did it make? How much produce did it produce? How much manufacturing were they able to calculate? Or blah, 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 blah. But that is not necessarily equivalent to, am I participating in a society which is actually bettering the rest of the society? Am I in the team that's winning for the right reasons in the right game? When you start to blur these lines, then obviously you have a very clouded affair when it comes to understanding what's good and what's bad. And then policy decisions end up reflecting that in a lot of ways. They just do more of what they think is the good thing, even if the good thing is not actually, in reality, the good thing. And the last point around this I'll make, and that is to say, once again, that young white men don't like going into the civil service, and in general now are being maybe disabused of their notions of working at all as a benefit to broader society when they see how it rewards them. You can go out and be a sportsman and make millions and millions and millions of dollars for kicking a soccer ball. Why wouldn't I want to aspire to do that? And if that fails, well, I'll just live with my parents until I'm 45. And this might sound like you've self-selected for defeating people, but when you make life seem like a lottery, then all you'll do is buy lottery tickets. If you make the chance of success seem reasonable, it seems feasible, then you'll have men strive for it, rather than what would be, say, the fox and the sour grapes. So I don't want the grapes because they're too high, but I don't want them. I'm going to make an excuse about why I wouldn't want them anyway. thus rendering them, you could say, in their own minds, they're at least projecting that it's not defeat, it's I'm not going to play the game because I wouldn't like the outcome anyway. And it's not true, obviously. Everyone wants to be successful. Everyone wants to be remembered and have that intrinsic motivator in them fulfilled. But in general, it becomes very difficult to see how you would do that. How would I go about being a hero in this day and age? It's just difficult to understand that proposition is a meaningful, coherent sentence, even that you could apply some cognizance from my existence to the actions that will require me to perform certain deeds, a certain quest, and from that derive my satisfaction, my greatness. I can't see that for myself, let alone if you're a 19, 20-year-old man at the moment. So this is maybe as an aside, but it goes on to say just a little bit more data. We all know we love data, and I'm running really long here on my schizo video. So I'll say that American federal workers earn a lot, and it's very clearly a job program for the less than capable. Americans have always had this sense of charitable duty about them, which is very noble. Unfortunately, it's been taken advantage of for many decades now, and this is particularly on the rise of the civil liberties for African Americans and now Hispanics. They underperform in almost every metric, so there has to be a way to uplift them without the, you could say, well, with the bigoted or the prejudice of low expectations. We say, I don't think you're very good. We know collectively you're not very good. You know you don't belong in society. You can't perform at the same level. So what I'll do is give you this charity that I'm going to cloak as actual office, an actual vocation, actual job. And it carries along a certain status with it. And now you can feel as if you're contributing to the broader society. It's all farce. And you can see that from the way that the structure of the sub-societies in America works. To say, if you're Hispanic, you bring less to the totality of America. Not that some individual Hispanics don't contribute more than, say, the average or the median. It's that as a collective, if you were to remove all of them, per capita, the country is better off. So the same thing works for the Africans, the same thing works for almost every other nationality. And you could say, look, I'm going to reduce it to economic outcomes. And we say, no, then we're going to keep Indians, then we're going to keep East Asians. But then once again, we're taking it as an economic stance, and it's not. This is a at worst, socio-economic stance, if not a almost metaphysical stance. What society do you want to reflect? Is it one of a Gothic soul, or is it one of all these other notions around transactional Americans? Can I buy myself to be an American for X trade-off? And that's, no. I'm going to say I'm American because I love McDonald's. I'm a lawyer. And so even though that I'm a Nepalese disabled female, I'm just as American as John Smith, who was the founding father. That's what we've reduced it to. It's a transactional piece of paper that we said, no, look, anyone can be it. It's a bit like Catholicism, right? You can just belong to the church. Doesn't matter where you're from, doesn't matter anything. As long as your inclinations are towards salvation, as towards Jesus Christ as the one and true prophet, then we don't mind. Well, if that's the club you can belong to, then the club's membership is worthless, right? So it has to be worth something, and if it's not, then you may as well make the gates open as you like. And this maybe is why the Americans have had such large swathes of illegal immigrants and not bothered to stop it, is because they viewed being an American as some sort of venture. So like, if you can come here and contribute, then you can just be an American. And obviously we've seen the degradation of their own society, that's not true. And the social cohesiveness, the community feeling of an America from 1890 to an America in 1990 to 2090 would be a massive linear decrease, because the feeling of being an American is no longer embodied by these people. They're just in America doing American things almost performatively. And this relates to every function of society. And on this video, obviously, I've tried to show you or illustrate how that's affected, in particular, civil service and bureaucracy. But we can paint this picture on any type of function, any type of recourse. But here you can see, maybe lastly, I'll just read out these charts, given that I took the time to snip them. number of million of men and female employees, tipped about 3 million in America. So 1% of the population is employed by the federal government, which is strikingly similar to the UK proportion percentage. So, and we remember philosophically that the Anglo-West was not a bureaucratic people. So it is very interesting that there's been a bloat of this sector, because the traditional underpinning of the free market society was that it was a piratical Vikinghood, where we would say all men have the chance to go out and achieve their own wealth, but no one else is going to help you with that. You have the tools available to you, and you go and make something of yourself in terms of money. But so it's very interesting that we've almost overcome this instinct of ours and gone into, no, this 55-year-old retard needs a job. Let me just prop him up for 15 years, pretending he works, and then pay him a pension on top, a sinecure or something, for his very gracious attitude towards serving the state. Yeah. So and then so that was the total percentage, and then workforce participation, just to show that it's been dropping, and that the larger the civil service becomes, and the larger the public purse is in dispensing, we call them the dole, but in general around giving out EBT cards, money, any type of dispensation, compensation for being unemployed, disabled, whatever it is, means that you no longer participate in the workforce, and you're thus relegated to a non-existent category around labour force participation. But women have been steady-ish, between the 74 to 76% over the last 20 years in terms of participation, but men has continually dropped. And this once again goes into that, you could say, very bleak and pernicious social view for young men around their possible outcomes, their opportunities. We say, look, you're not disenfranchised necessarily, but young white men, you have a very, very long uphill battle to be fine. It almost Sisyphus, keep pushing that stone, right? But the stone just keeps getting bigger, the hill keeps getting bigger, and the projected goal, the outcome, the remuneration gets smaller and smaller from a relative perspective. It gets less appealing, and anything that they can say that you want now that money could have bought you becomes less rewarding. Why would I want this thing? And sometimes it is a cop-out, but sometimes it's true. Sometimes the thing that they tell you you want, you actually probably don't, and the hard work required to get there wasn't worth it at all. Say, no, you want the big house, you want the fancy car, you want to go eat at these restaurants, you want to go on 15 holidays every year. I genuinely don't think a lot of these things are worth it. Now, you should be empire building, and I think that's the nature of man in a lot of ways, to want to do that. But if the trade-off is to be a wage slave and boxed in with some old hag nagging you every single waking hour of your working day to say, have you delivered this? Have you delivered that? Then why would anyone want to appeal to that? And it's bad enough in the private sector, where you're probably paid better, you have development opportunities, you can learn, you can develop skills, you can see some design around your destiny. Whereas in the public sector, if I'm sitting next to some old fat bloke or some annoying haggard woman, this is the next 40 years of my life. For what?